The first thing you would have noticed wasn't the sight, it was the smell. If you have ever stood in a pine forest after a heavy rain, you know that scent. It is crisp, sharp, almost like a cleaning chemical mixed with damp earth. It is the smell of life. But on this particular morning, in the deep hollows of Kentucky, that clean pine scent was losing a war against something much heavier, something copper-like. The thick metallic stench of iron that had been spilled by the gallon. It is dawn. The mist is clinging to the valley floor, swirling around the trunks of trees that are wider than a wagon wheel. From a distance, the scene looks almost peaceful. A cluster of rough-hewn log cabins, smoke rising gently from a chimney. The sounds of the waking forest, a jaybird screeching, the rustle of wind in the canopy. But if you stepped closer, the illusion would shatter. Because the mud between the cabins isn't brown, it is a churning, slushy red. There is an axe embedded in the doorframe of the main office, but there is no woodcutter holding it. There is a boot lying in the middle of the path, and the terrifying part is that the laces are still tied tight, as if the foot inside it simply vanished or was dragged away. This is not a battlefield from the Civil War. That ended 20 years ago. This isn't the site of a train wreck. This is a workplace. Welcome to 1887. Welcome to the edge of the known world. In the late 19th century, the American logging camp was the engine room of the nation. It was where the raw material for your great-grandfather's house, his furniture, and his coffin came from. It was a place of immense physical power, where men with arms like hydraulic pistons turned chaos into commerce. But on this morning, the commerce had stopped. The silence that hangs over this camp is heavy. It is the kind of silence that screams. Inside the main cabin, the chief, the man who ran this operation with an iron fist just 24 hours ago, is no longer giving orders. He is lying amidst the wreckage of his own command post. The furniture is splintered. The ledger books, usually kept in immaculate rows, are scattered across the floor, their pages soaking up the fluids of the men who wrote in them. What happened here? It wasn't a bear attack. The wounds are too precise for that. It wasn't a raid by bandits looking for gold, because there was no gold here to steal. This was something far more personal and far more terrifying. You see, usually when we talk about history, we talk about the big events, the wars, the treaties, the elections. We look at the timeline from a bird's eye view. But today, we are going to drop down into the mud. We are going to look at what happens when a group of men are pushed to the absolute limit of their sanity, miles away from the nearest sheriff, locked together in a green prison of their own making. They say the trees in Kentucky have deep roots, that they hold the soil together against the floods and the landslides. But in 1887, those roots drank something other than rain. And the story of how this camp went from a place of labor to a slaughterhouse in a single night is one that didn't make it into the school textbooks. It was too ugly. It was too real. And honestly, it was too close to the truth of what lurks inside all of us when the lights go out. But before we can understand the blood, we have to understand the land. We have to look at the map. Because to understand why no one heard them scream, you have to see just how far away from God they really were. To understand the nightmare, you first have to understand the cage. When we think of Kentucky today, we might think of rolling bluegrass hills, horse farms, or maybe the suburbs of Louisville. We think of a place that is tamed, a place mapped by satellites and crossed by asphalt highways. But the Kentucky of 1887 was a different planet. Specifically, the Appalachian region in the eastern part of the state. This was not farmland. This was the Black Forest of America. We are talking about virgin timber, trees that had been growing since before Columbus landed in the Caribbean. White oaks, poplars, and chestnuts that stood over 100 feet tall. Their trunks were so thick that 3 grown men holding hands couldn't circle them. And they grew so close together that in some hollows, the sun didn't touch the ground even at high noon. It was a world of perpetual twilight. If you look at a map from that era, you see vast blank spaces, no towns, no roads, just the squiggle of a creek or the jagged line of a ridge. To get to the lumber camp we are talking about today, you didn't just hop in a car. You took a train to the end of the line, then you hired a mule, and then, when the mule couldn't go any further, you walked. For days. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was absolute. There were no cell phones to check the news, no radios to hear a friendly voice. If you got sick out here, you either got better or you died. If you broke your leg, it was a life sentence. The nearest doctor was a 3-day ride through terrain that would kill a horse. To the wealthy investors sitting in their clubs in New York or Chicago, looking at photographs of this timber, this place looked like a gold mine. It was resources waiting to be harvested. To the poets and the painters, it looked like paradise, a pristine, untouched Eden. But to the men inside, it was a cage with no bars, only miles of crushing wilderness. Imagine that feeling. You are surrounded by beauty, yes, but that beauty is indifferent to you. The mountains don't care if you are cold. The river doesn't care if you drown. And after a week, or a month, or 6 months of seeing nothing but tree bark and mud, the walls start to close in. Psychologists today talk about sensory deprivation or the effects of confinement on the human mind. We see it in prisoners in solitary confinement. We see it in researchers in Antarctica. The mind needs variety. It needs stimulation. When you strip that away and replace it with the repetitive, back-breaking monotony of swinging an axe against a wall of wood that never seems to end, the mind starts to eat itself. The silence of the woods is not quiet. It's loud. It amplifies your own thoughts. It amplifies your grievances. Small annoyances, the way a man chews his tobacco, the way the foreman looks at you, the draft in the cabin, stop being annoyances. They become obsessions. In this camp, 40 men were living on top of each other in rough-built shanties. They slept in bunks filled with straw and lice. They smelled of unwashed wool and sweat. And outside that thin wooden wall was the dark, infinite forest, pressing in on all sides. There was no escape. The only way out was to work your contract, get your money, and walk back to civilization. But what happens when the one thing keeping you sane, the promise of that money, starts to slip away? What happens when the cage door locks and you realize the key is in the pocket of a man who doesn't respect you? To answer that, we have to look at the prisoners of this green hell. Who were they? Who signs up for a job that breaks your back for pennies a day? They were known as timber beasts. That wasn't an insult thrown at them by the newspapers. It was a badge of honor they wore themselves. Because to survive this work, you had to be something more than a man. You had to be part machine, part animal. The workforce of a Kentucky logging camp in the 1880s was a motley collection of humanity's drift. The Civil War had ended only 22 years prior. Many of the older men in the camp were veterans. They had seen the horrors of Shiloh or Antietam. They carried shrapnel in their legs and ghosts in their heads. They were men who had learned that life was cheap and that violence was a valid way to solve a problem. Then you had the immigrants, Irish, Swedish, German. Men who had crossed an ocean with nothing but the clothes on their backs, chasing the American dream, only to find themselves hacking at trees in a language they barely understood. And finally, the locals, the mountain men. People who had been born in the shadow of these peaks, who knew the woods better than they knew the Bible. But despite their differences, the camp ground them all down into the same shape. The work was brutal in a way that is hard for us to comprehend today. We have chainsaws, we have heavy machinery, we have OSHA regulations. They had nothing but muscle and physics. A standard day began at 4 a.m. Breakfast was a heavy, greasy affair. Biscuits, pork fat, beans, coffee thick enough to float a horseshoe. By 5 a.m., they were in the woods. Imagine cutting down a tree the size of a lighthouse using only a handsaw. 2 men, one on each end of a 7-foot steel blade known as a misery whip. Pull, push, pull, push. For 12 hours. Your shoulders burn, your hands blister, then calloused, then bleed, then calloused again until they feel like leather gloves. And the danger was constant. These trees weighed tons. When they fell, they didn't just tip over nicely. They crashed. They shattered other trees. Branches the size of telephone poles would snap off and come rocketing down. They called them widowmakers for a reason. If you were standing in the wrong spot, you didn't just get hurt. You were erased. Men were crushed. Men were decapitated by snapping cables. Men lost feet to slipping axe heads. And if you got hurt, you were fired. There was no workers' compensation. There was no sick leave. If you couldn't swing the axe, you were dead weight. This created a specific type of psychology, a hardness. You couldn't afford to be soft. You couldn't afford to care too much. You worked, you ate, you slept, and you prayed you didn't die. But there was a glue that held this volatile mix of men together. It wasn't friendship, necessarily, and it certainly wasn't loyalty to the company. It was the paycheck. They were enduring this hell for a reason. $1.50 to $2 a day. That sounds like a joke to us, but in 1887, $1 a day was a living wage. A season in the woods could mean paying off the farm back home. It could mean buying a wedding ring. It could mean a fresh start in the West. Every swing of the axe was an investment in the future. They were banking their sweat, expecting a return. They trusted the system. They trusted that if they did the work, they would get the reward. It's the fundamental social contract of civilization, labor for capital. But in this camp, there was a middleman between the labor and the capital. A man who sat in the warm office while they froze in the woods. A man who held the ledger and, more importantly, held the keys to the company's store. And this man, well, let's just say he didn't see these workers as partners. He saw them as assets, and depreciating ones at that. There is an old song made famous by Tennessee Ernie Ford. You probably know the chorus. St. Peter, don't you call me 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. We tap our feet to it. It's a catchy tune. But the reality behind those lyrics was a system of economic entrapment so effective it was practically slavery by another name. Here is how it worked. The logging camp was an island. As we established, it was miles from the nearest town. That meant you couldn't just pop down to the local market to buy tobacco or new boots or a bar of soap. You had to buy it from the camp, and the camp had a store. This store was run by the company and overseen by the camp chief. And since they had a monopoly, literally the only shop within a 3-day walk, they could set the prices. Need a new pair of boots because yours rotted off your feet in the mud? That will be $5. In town, they might cost $2. But you are not in town. You are here. Want a tin of tobacco to calm your nerves after a near-death experience with a falling oak? That's double the market rate. But here is the catch. You didn't pay with cash. You didn't have any cash. You were working on credit. The cost of your purchases was deducted from your future wages. The chief would open the big leather-bound ledger, find your name, and scribble a number in the debit column. It sounds convenient, but it was a trap. Many of these men arrived at the camp already in debt. The company had paid for their train ticket. The company had paid for their tools. So before they even swung an axe for the first time, they were already in the hole. Week after week, they worked. Week after week, they bought necessities. And week after week, the chief tallied the numbers. The camp chief in this story is a figure who has been largely lost to history, reduced to a title. We don't know if he was inherently evil or just a bureaucrat doing his job. But to the men, he was a dictator. He lived in the main cabin, which was slightly better built than the others. He ate better food. He wore clean clothes. While the men were covered in sap and mud, he smelled of paper and ink. He represented the company, the distant, faceless entity that owned the trees, the land, and seemingly the men themselves. Tensions in the camp usually simmered at a low boil. Grievances about the quality of the beans or the sharpness of the saws. But in the winter of 1887, something shifted. The ledger wasn't balancing. Rumors started to circulate, whispers in the bunkhouse after the lights went out. "Have you seen your tally?" one man would ask. "He charged me for a broken axe handle I didn't break," another would reply. "He says I only worked 5 days last week. I worked 6. Paranoia is a powerful poison. In the isolation of the mountains, it spreads like wildfire. The men began to suspect that the game was rigged, that no matter how hard they worked, the debt column was growing faster than the credit column. They weren't just working for free, they were paying for the privilege of breaking their backs. And then, the rumor changed. It stopped being about small errors. It became something much more dangerous. The rumor was that the company was broke, that the payroll train wasn't coming, that the chief was hoarding what little cash was left, planning to pack up and leave them stranded in the winter with nothing to show for months of labor but broken bodies and empty pockets. This wasn't just unfairness anymore, this was theft. This was survival. And when you back a timber beast into a corner and threaten to take the food out of his mouth, he doesn't hire a lawyer. He reaches for the nearest sharp object. The spark that lit the fuse wasn't a speech. It wasn't a grand declaration of war. It was a piece of paper. It was a chilly afternoon just a few days before the massacre. A group of the most vocal workers, the ringleaders, though they probably didn't see themselves that way yet, approached the main cabin. They wanted to see the books. They wanted to settle up. This was a standard procedure. A worker had the right to check his standing. But on this day, the mood was different. The air was thick with that specific kind of static electricity you feel before a thunderstorm. They walked into the office. The chief was there, likely surrounded by his small circle of loyalists, clerks, foremen, men whose paychecks depended on maintaining the status quo. According to the accounts that survived, the conversation started civilly. "How much am I owed?" The chief opened the ledger. He ran his finger down the column. "After deductions for room, board, tools, and the advance, you owe us $3. Silence. Imagine the sound of a heart breaking, followed immediately by the sound of blood boiling. This man had worked for 2 months. He had risked his life daily. He had missed his family. And he was being told that mathematically he had paid the company for the privilege of working there. It wasn't just him. Another man stepped up. "And me? $4 balance due." A third man. "What about my overtime?" "Not recorded. You didn't meet the quota." It wasn't a fortune they were fighting for. The total amounts in dispute, adjusted for inflation, would be a few $100s today. It was barely enough to buy a train ticket. But when you have nothing, barely enough becomes everything. It becomes the difference between going home a hero and going home a beggar. The men left the office. They didn't shout. They didn't flip the table. Not yet. They went back to the bunkhouses. And that is where the poison truly set in. If you have ever been in a toxic workplace, you know how these conversations go. But imagine there is no HR department. Imagine there is no home to go to at 5 p.m. You are stuck there with the people who are just as angry as you are. The bunkhouse became a pressure cooker. The men sat on their bunks, sharpening their tools. The rhythmic sound of a whetstone on steel, shk, 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 became the soundtrack of the evening. "He's lying," someone said. "He's pocketing the difference," said another. "He thinks we're stupid. He thinks because we can't read his fancy writing we can't count." The narrative shifted. The chief wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a thief, a villain, a monster who was stealing the food from their children's mouths. And the chief? He made a fatal error. He underestimated them. He assumed that because he had the authority and the ledger and the backing of the company, he was safe. He assumed these men were just dumb labor. He didn't realize he was sitting on a pile of dynamite and he had just lit a match. He sent word that anyone who wasn't satisfied could leave. But they couldn't leave. Leaving meant walking 50 miles with no money and no food. They were trapped. So the logic of the desperate took over. If the law won't help us, We make our own law. If the ledger says we are broke, we burn the ledger. If the chief stands in our way, well, the plan wasn't written down. It wasn't voted on. It emerged organically from the rage. It was a collective understanding that spread through the camp like a virus. Tomorrow night, we take what is ours. The sun sets early in the mountains. By 4:30 p.m., the hollow is already plunged into shadow. The temperature drops like a stone. On the evening of the massacre, the weather turned. A cold drizzle began to fall, turning the dirt paths of the camp into a slick, freezing mud. It was the kind of weather that drives men indoors, huddled around the cast-iron stoves, seeking warmth. If you were a bird flying over the camp that night, you would have seen the glow of oil lamps in the windows. You would have seen the smoke curling from the chimneys. It looked domestic. It looked normal. But inside the bunkhouses, the routine had broken. Usually the evenings were filled with noise, men playing cards, playing the fiddle, telling tall tales, mending their clothes. Tonight, the fiddle was in its case. The cards were in the box. The men were waiting. There is a psychological phenomenon called group polarization. When a group of like-minded people discuss a grievance, their views don't just stay the same, they become more extreme. The angry man becomes furious, the violent man becomes murderous, and the hesitant man, he gets swept along, afraid to be the only one standing still when the wave crashes. In the main cabin, the chief and his supporters, about 10 or 12 men, were also aware that something was wrong. You can feel it when 40 men stop talking to you. You can feel the eyes on your back. They barricaded the door. Not a heavy fortification, just a heavy wooden beam dropped into place. They checked their weapons, a few revolvers, a shotgun. They were nervous, but they were confident. They were the authority. They believed that the hierarchy of the world would protect them. Workers don't attack bosses. It just isn't done. They'll cool off by morning, someone probably said. Just let them sleep it off. But sleep was not on the agenda. Around 8 p.m., the movement started. It wasn't a military formation. It was a mob. A dark, amorphous shape moving through the rain. They didn't carry torches. They didn't need them. They knew every inch of this ground. They carried the tools of their trade. In the hands of a skilled logger, a double-bitted axe is an extension of the arm. It is balanced perfectly. It is razor-sharp, literally sharp enough to shave with. These men spent 12 hours a day swinging these heavy blades. They had the muscle memory to hit a specific spot on a tree trunk within a fraction of an inch, over and over again. Now, they were adjusting their grip. They weren't aiming for pine bark. They gathered outside the main cabin. The rain pattered against the brims of their hats. The mud squelched under their boots. Inside, the chief heard them. The heavy thud of 40 pairs of boots stopping at once. The murmur of voices. He stood up from his desk. He walked to the door. He didn't open it. He shouted through the thick wood, "Go back to your bunks. We will discuss this in the morning." A voice from the outside answered. We don't know whose voice it was. Maybe it was the man who was told he owed $3. Maybe it was the man whose children were hungry back home. "We are done talking," the voice said. "Open the door." "This is company property," the chief yelled back. "You are trespassing." It is almost tragic. He was still trying to use the language of business. He was still trying to invoke property rights. He didn't realize that those laws had evaporated the moment the sun went down. There was a pause, a heartbeat of silence in the freezing rain, and then the sound of the first blow. Thwack! It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of steel biting into wood. The door to the main cabin was built from solid oak planks, 2 inches thick. It was designed to keep out bears and the winter wind. It was not designed to withstand a siege. Inside the cabin, the sound must have been deafening. The wood didn't just vibrate, it groaned. Splinters flew inward. "Stop that! I'll shoot!" the chief screamed. He pulled a revolver from his desk drawer. A Smith & Wesson likely. Heavy, reliable, deadly. But he hesitated. And this is a crucial moment. Why did he hesitate? Because shooting a man is not easy, even for a hard man in a hard time. To pull that trigger is to cross a line from which there is no return. If he fired, he wasn't just defending himself, he was starting a war he couldn't win. He had 6 bullets. There were 40 men outside. "Open it, or we'll bring the roof down on your heads," the mob roared. The supporters inside, the clerks, the foremen, were backing away from the door, pressing themselves against the far walls. Their eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering lamplight. They were realizing, perhaps for the first time, that their authority was a fiction. It only existed as long as the majority agreed to it. The majority had just revoked their consent. Another blow. Crack. The heavy wooden bar holding the door shut began to splinter. The iron hinges shrieked under the strain. "We want our money! We want what's ours!" The shouting wasn't coherent anymore. It was a cacophony of rage. It was the sound of men who had been pushed too far, letting go of the leash. The chief aimed at the door. His hand was shaking, not from fear perhaps, but from the adrenaline dumping into his system. Bang! He fired. A warning shot? A panic shot? The bullet punched through the wood near the top of the door frame. Outside, the mob didn't scatter. They didn't run. If anything, the gunshot had the opposite effect. It validated them. It proved that the company was trying to kill them. It turned a labor dispute into a battle for survival. "They're shooting! Get 'em!" The axes swung harder now. Not just one man, but 3 or 4, hacking at the door, the window frames, the walls themselves. The cabin was being dismantled from the outside in. Imagine the terror of those inside. The walls that protected you are literally being chopped away. The sanctuary is becoming a coffin. The door gave way with a sickening crunch. It fell inward, hanging by one twisted hinge. For a second, there was a stillness, a tableau. On one side, the dark, rain-soaked figures of the workers, their breath steaming in the cold air, axes raised like executioners. On the other side, the chief and his men, bathed in the warm yellow light of the oil lamps, holding their feeble guns. It was the collision of 2 worlds, the haves and the have-nots, the managers and the managed. And then, a man from the mob stepped over the threshold. He didn't say a word. He just raised his axe. The chief fired again. The muzzle flash illuminated the room for a split second. The man stumbled, but he didn't fall. The mob surged forward like a dam breaking. The time for talking was over. The time for the ledger was over. Now it was time for the iron. Before we describe what happened inside that room, we need to pause. We need to look at the instruments of this tragedy. In a modern crime scene, you expect to find 9mm casings, maybe a knife. In 1887, the weapons were agricultural, and that makes them infinitely more horrifying. The primary weapon was the double-bitted axe. This is a tool that weighs about 3 to 5 pounds. The head is solid steel. One side is ground to a razor edge for felling, cutting across the grain. The other side is slightly thicker, used for limbing, chopping through knots and branches. When swung by a man who does this for a living, the tip of that axe is traveling at over 50 miles per hour. The force at the point of impact is tremendous. An axe is designed to split oak. It is designed to shatter the density of hardwood that has stood for centuries. It does not distinguish between wood and bone. A skull offers about as much resistance to a logging axe as a melon offers to a sledgehammer. Then there were the knives. Every logger carried a belt knife. These weren't pocket knives. These were tools used for skinning game, cutting rope, eating dinner. Fixed blades, carbon steel, honed on the same stones as the axes. And the guns. The firearms of this era were not the precision instruments we have today. They were heavy, black powder beasts. When you fired a revolver in a closed room in 1887, you didn't just get a bullet. You got a cloud of sulfurous smoke that instantly blinded everyone. The fog of war wasn't a metaphor here. It was literal. After the second or third shot, Visibility in that cabin would have dropped to zero. The lamps were likely knocked over or extinguished in the scuffle. So, imagine this fight. Pitch darkness. The air filled with choking, stinging smoke. The smell of unwashed bodies, fear, and gunpowder. And in that blackness, the sound of axes whistling through the air. You couldn't see who you were hitting. You couldn't see if it was the chief, or a friend, or your own brother. You just swung. You swung because if you stopped, the next blow might land on you. It became a frenzy, a meat grinder. The forensic reconstruction of 19th century massacres is difficult because the pathology reports were primitive. But accounts from similar events describe wounds that are hard to even read about. Severed limbs, crushed rib cages, men shot at point-blank range, the powder burns tattooing their skin. This wasn't a duel. It wasn't a shootout at high noon. It was a butchery in a closet. The energy released in that room was primal. It was the release of months of repressed anger, exhaustion, and humiliation. They weren't just attacking a person. They were attacking the source of their misery. They were trying to chop their way out of the trap. But in the dark, with adrenaline pumping, precision is the first thing to go. And chaos takes the wheel. The battle for the main cabin lasted maybe 5 minutes. But for those inside, it must have felt like a lifetime. The mob poured through the broken door like water rushing into a sinking ship. The room was small, maybe 20 by 20 feet. Suddenly, it held 30 screaming men. The chief had retreated behind his heavy oak desk. He fired blindly into the mass of bodies. One man went down, clutching his shoulder. Another dropped to his knees, screaming. But the momentum was unstoppable. The desk, the symbol of his authority, the altar of the ledger, was overturned. It crashed against the wall, spilling ink and papers everywhere. The chief was swarmed. We don't need to describe every blow. Your imagination is doing that work right now. But the result was absolute. The man who had held their lives in his hands was gone, lost under a flurry of boots and fists and steel. But the violence didn't stop with him. The clerks, the foreman, the men who had stood by him realized too late that there was no mercy in the room. They tried to fight back. They swung chairs. They used firewood as clubs. One of the foremen, a man named Miller, according to some accounts, managed to smash a window. He dove out into the mud, glass shards tearing at his clothes. "Run!" he screamed. "They're killing everyone!" This scream changed the dynamic of the night. Up until this moment, the violence was contained. It was focused on the office. It was a mutiny. But when Miller ran, the mob turned into a hunting party. "Don't let them get away. They'll bring the law. Get the witnesses." The logic of the massacre shifted again. Now, it wasn't about revenge. It was about cover-up. It was about silencing anyone who could point a finger. The attackers spilled out of the cabin, their chests heaving, their weapons slick. They looked into the darkness of the camp. There were other men in the camp, cooks, stable hands, workers who hadn't joined the mob. Men who had stayed in their bunks, pulling the blankets over their heads, praying the storm would pass. But now the storm was coming for them. The paranoia said, "If you aren't with us, you're against us." The paranoia said, "If you saw what we did, you are a threat." The attackers split up. They moved toward the stables. They moved toward the supply shed. The lights in the other cabins were quickly snuffed out. The camp went dark. And then the chase began. The forest, which had been a prison, suddenly became the only hope for survival. Miller, the foreman who jumped through the window, didn't stop running. He scrambled up the muddy bank behind the cabins. He was barefoot, he was bleeding, but fear is a powerful fuel. He wasn't alone. 3 or 4 others had managed to slip away in the confusion. They scattered like quail. But running in a Kentucky forest at night is not like running on a track. It is a nightmare of obstacles. Roots snag your ankles. Thorny vines, greenbrier and blackberry, tear at your skin like barbed wire. Ravines open up suddenly in the dark, dropping 10 or 20 feet into rocky creek beds. And behind them, they could hear the pursuers. The mob wasn't moving quietly anymore. They were shouting, calling out names. "Come out, Miller. We just want to talk." There's nowhere to go. It is a terrifying psychological game. To be hunted by men you worked with just yesterday. Men whose names you know. Men whose families you asked about. Miller hid in a hollowed-out chestnut stump. He pressed himself into the rotting wood, holding his breath. He could hear the heavy footsteps squelching in the mud just yards away. He could hear the heavy breathing of a man standing right there, axe in hand, listening. The darkness was total. The rain masked the sound of breathing, but it also masked the sound of the approach. Imagine the sensory deprivation. You can't see. You can't trust your ears. You are cold, wet, and convinced that the next second will be your last. Somewhere to the east, a gunshot echoed. A scream cut short. They had found someone. The realization hit the survivors. This wasn't just a beating. This was an extermination. The mob had crossed the Rubicon. They knew that if one witness survived to reach the town, they would all hang. The only safety lay in total silence. So they hunted. They checked the stables. They poked their pitchforks into the haylofts. They checked the tool sheds. For an hour, the woods were alive with this deadly game of hide and seek. But eventually, the adrenaline of the attackers began to fade. The cold rain soaked through their rage. The sheer physical exhaustion of the day, combined with the explosion of violence, took its toll. The shouting died down. The footsteps became less frequent. The woods returned to their natural state, silent, indifferent, vast. Miller stayed in that stump for hours. He didn't move until his muscles cramped. He didn't move until the grey light of dawn began to filter through the canopy. He was alive, but he was alone, and he was miles from help. There is a specific kind of hangover that comes after extreme violence. It isn't caused by alcohol. It is a chemical crash. For an hour, the men of the mob were running on pure cortisol and norepinephrine. They were gods of vengeance. They felt no cold, no pain, no fear, but physiology always collects its debt. As the fires in the stoves burned down to embers, the reality of the situation began to settle over the camp like a shroud. The men retreated back to the bunkhouses, not to celebrate. There were no cheers. There were no toasts. They sat on the edges of their bunks, staring at their hands. Hands that were stained dark. Hands that were trembling uncontrollably. "What did we do?" someone whispered. "We had to," another replied, but his voice lacked conviction. He was going to starve us. But we killed him. We killed them. The justification, the righteous anger, was starting to crumble under the weight of the corpse in the main cabin. Adrenaline masks pain, but adrenaline eventually fades. And then, the reality sets in. One worker looked down and realized his own leg was gashed open. He hadn't even felt it happen. Another was nursing a broken hand. The physical toll was emerging, but the psychological toll was heavier. They were now murderers. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of God, and perhaps most terrifyingly, in the eyes of each other. A strange dynamic began to form. They were bound together now by a blood pact they hadn't signed. They couldn't leave. They couldn't turn each other in. They were stuck in this room with these people forever. The trust was gone. If he could kill the chief with an axe, could he kill me to keep me quiet? Paranoia returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't directed at the boss. It was directed inward. Outside, the rain turned to snow. The temperature plummeted. The bodies lay where they fell, in the mud, in the office, in the brush. The camp, usually a place of snoring and shifting bodies, was wide awake. 40 men lying in the dark, listening to the wind, replaying the last hour in their heads. Every creak of the wood sounded like a sheriff's footstep. Every howl of a wolf sounded like a scream. They knew the morning would come. They knew the sun would rise and illuminate what they had done. The darkness had been their accomplice, hiding the details. The light would be their judge. They waited, and the silence of the Kentucky mountains, usually so peaceful, felt like the holding cell of a death row. Dawn in the mountains is usually beautiful. The sun hits the peaks first, turning the mist into a glowing gold river. But on the morning of the aftermath, the sun didn't bring warmth. It brought clarity, and clarity was the last thing these men wanted. As the light crept into the valley, the full extent of the horror was revealed. The main cabin was a ruin. The door was gone. The windows were shattered. Inside, it looked less like a room and more like a slaughterhouse floor. The ledger, the object of all that rage, was found trampled into the bloody floorboards, its pages torn and soaked. The chief's body was moved, not out of respect, but out of necessity. They wrapped him in a canvas tarp. It was a grim task. The men who did it didn't look at his face. They couldn't. Outside, the rain had washed some of the blood into the soil, but the mud was still stained a rusty brown. There were deep gouges in the door frames where axes had missed their marks. There were shell casings glinting in the dirt. The camp was silent. The steam donkey engine was cold. The horses in the stable were restless, sensing the death in the air. The workers emerged from the bunkhouses like ghosts. They moved slowly. They didn't make eye contact. What do you do the morning after a mutiny? Do you go to work? Do you pick up the axe, the same axe you used as a weapon last night, and go back to chopping trees? It seems insane, but that is exactly what some of them did. Habit is a powerful thing, and denial is even stronger. A few men actually walked toward the tree line, tools in hand. Maybe they thought if they just kept working, they could pretend it didn't happen. Maybe they thought if they looked busy, the consequences wouldn't find them. But most just wandered aimlessly. They were waiting. They knew Miller had escaped. They knew he was out there, and they knew what that meant. The clock was ticking. It wasn't a question of if the law would come. It was a question of when. They started to pack, not in a panic, but with a strange, lethargic resignation. They stuffed their few belongings into sacks, a spare shirt, a tin cup, a picture of a wife they might never see again. Some slipped away into the woods, hoping to disappear before the sheriff arrived. They chose the fugitive life. Others stayed. Perhaps they felt they had nowhere to go. Perhaps they thought they could talk their way out of it. It was self-defense they rehearsed. He shot first. The camp, once a hive of industry, was now a graveyard waiting for the undertaker. And miles away, the undertaker was already being summoned. While the camp sat in its stupor, Miller was moving. He had been running, walking, and crawling for 8 hours. He was barefoot. His feet were shredded by rocks and thorns. The cold mud had numbed his toes to the point where he couldn't feel them anymore, which was probably a mercy. He wasn't running just to save his own life anymore. He was running on a mission. He had to reach the railhead. The distance was roughly 20 miles. In a car, that's 30 minutes. On foot, through untamed Appalachian wilderness, in the snow and mud, it is a marathon of pain. He avoided the trails. He knew that if the mob had sent riders after him, the trails were death traps. He stuck to the ridges, moving parallel to the creek. Every snap of a twig made him freeze. Every shadow looked like a man with an axe. He was hallucinating from exhaustion. The trees seemed to be leaning in, whispering. The wind sounded like voices, but he kept moving. Why? Because he was the witness. He carried the truth. If he died in these woods, the story died with him. The chief would just be another man who vanished in the mountains. The company would write it off as an accident. He reached the edge of the small settlement near the train tracks around noon. He must have looked like a monster. Covered in mud, clothes torn to rags, dried blood on his face. He stumbled into the general store, the only place with a telegraph or a telephone line to the county seat. The shopkeeper looked up, terrified. "Good God, man. What happened?" Miller collapsed onto a crate. He gasped out the words that would bring the hammer down. They killed him. They killed them all. Send the sheriff. The message went out over the wire. Dots and dashes traveling instantly across the miles that had taken him all night to cross. Trouble at Camp 4. Send deputies. Urgent. In the county seat, the sheriff read the telegram. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wait. In 1887, the law didn't come with sirens and flashing lights. It came on horseback, heavily armed. The sheriff gathered a posse. He deputized men on the spot. Bring your Winchester, he said. We have a war in the woods. They rode out within the hour. Miller watched them go. He didn't go back. He never went back. But the wheels of justice, slow, grinding, and often brutal, had been set in motion. The posse arrived at the camp 2 days later. They expected a fight. They rode in with rifles raised, spread out in a skirmish line. But they didn't find a fortress. They found a ghost town. Most of the workers had fled. The ones who remained were the broken ones, the old, the injured, or the ones who simply didn't have the will to run. They offered no resistance. They surrendered their axes and their few pitiful firearms. The investigation that followed was less CSY and more Wild West. The sheriff wasn't interested in fingerprints. He wasn't interested in motive. He looked at the body of the chief, still wrapped in the tarp. He looked at the blood on the floor. "Who did this?" he asked. Silence. I said, "Who did this? If you don't speak, you all hang." This is where the law of the frontier gets complicated. In a modern court, you need to prove who struck the fatal blow. You need to prove intent. You need individual culpability. But in 1887, there was a concept known as joint enterprise. If you were part of the mob, you were guilty of the murder. It didn't matter if you swung the axe or just held the lantern. You were there. You were complicit. But identifying them was a nightmare. The men who stayed claimed they were asleep. They claimed they saw nothing. They claimed strangers came out of the woods. It was a wall of silence. But the law has ways of breaking walls. They arrested everyone. They chained them together and marched them back to town. It was a long, humiliating procession. The timber beasts, now shackled like animals. The trial was swift. The newspapers had a field day. They painted the workers as savages, anarchists, monsters of the forest. The nuance of the debt, the starvation, the unfairness that didn't sell papers. Axe murderers sold papers. Miller testified. He pointed fingers. That one was there. That one held the door. But even he couldn't be sure in the dark. In the end, justice was messy. A few men were sentenced to hard labor. A few were acquitted for lack of evidence. But the ringleaders, the ones who actually struck the blows, most of them were never caught. They vanished into the West. They changed their names. They melted into the vastness of America. In the mountains, there is the law of the book and the law of the blood. They rarely speak the same language. The law of the book said justice was served. Some men went to prison. The case was closed. But the law of the blood knew the truth. The real perpetrators, the rage, the desperation, the system that pushed them, walked free. And the men who went to prison, they weren't the villains. They were just the ones who got caught standing still when the music stopped. So, what did the company do? You might expect that after a tragedy like this, a massacre of their own management, a destruction of their property, there would be a reckoning, a change in policy, maybe even a memorial. You would be wrong. To the lumber barons sitting in their mahogany-paneled boardrooms in Chicago or Philadelphia, this event was not a tragedy. It was a line item. It was a write-off. The telegram arrived. Operations suspended at Camp 4 due to labor unrest. Manager deceased. Equipment damaged. They didn't weep for the chief. He was an employee. He was replaceable. They didn't weep for the workers. They were tools. They were replaceable. The only thing that mattered was the timber. The trees were still standing. The asset was still there. Within 2 weeks, A new manager was hired. He was likely given a slightly higher salary, hazard pay. He was given a new ledger. New workers were recruited. They pulled them from the cities, from the arriving boats at Ellis Island. Job opening in Kentucky, the flyers said. Good wages, fresh air. They didn't mention the axes. They didn't mention the blood soaked into the floorboards of the cabin they would be sleeping in. The families of the dead? They got nothing. No pension, no apology. If anything, the company likely sent a bill to the widows for the unrecovered debt of their dead husbands. This is the cold, hard math of the industrial age. The machine does not stop for the individual. It grinds on. The camp reopened before the winter was even out. The new men slept in the same bunks. They ate at the same tables. Did they know? Maybe they found a dark stain on the wood that wouldn't scrub out. Maybe they found a notch in a door frame and wondered what made it. But they didn't ask. You don't ask questions when you need the money. The lumber from that season, the trees cut by the men who replaced the murderers, was shipped down the river. It was milled into planks. It built houses in Cincinnati. It built barns in Indiana. People lived in those houses. They raised children within those walls. They had no idea that the wood surrounding them was harvested in the shadow of a massacre. This is the terrifying resilience of commerce. It absorbs horror and turns it into profit. The story of the massacre faded. It became a local legend, then a rumor, then just a ghost story told to scare children. Don't go into the hollow at night, or the timber beasts will get you. But the real beast wasn't in the woods. It was in the ledger. And the ledger was open for business again. We need to step back from the history for a moment and look at the psychology. Because what happened in that camp wasn't just a labor dispute. It was a breakdown of the human mind. We have a name for it in pop culture, cabin fever. We smile when we say it. We think of Jack Nicholson in The Shining. But the clinical reality is much darker. The medical term is often linked to amok syndrome, a sudden, unprovoked outburst of violence by a person who has been under intense social pressure or isolation. When you put men in a confined space, remove their autonomy, strip them of their individuality, and subject them to constant, repetitive stress, you are rewiring their brains. The brain starts to look for threats. It becomes hypervigilant. In the 1880s, they called it mountain madness or bunkhouse psychosis. Think about the sensory environment. For months, these men saw the same 40 faces. They heard the same voices. They smelled the same smells. There was no privacy. If you wanted to cry, you couldn't. If you wanted to scream, you couldn't. You had to bottle it up. And that bottle has a pressure limit. When the chief denied them their wages, he didn't just take their money. He took their hope. He took the one thing that allowed them to tolerate the intolerable. Without the promise of a reward, the suffering became meaningless. And meaningless suffering is the mother of violence. It's the same psychological mechanism we see in prison riots. It's not about the bad food. It's about the loss of agency. It's about the need to assert control over something, even if that something is the act of destruction. When the mob attacked the cabin, they weren't just killing a boss. They were killing the system. They were smashing the cage. For those few minutes of violence, they were free. They were powerful. They were gods of their own destiny. And then, the crash. It is a tragedy of human nature. We are social animals, but we are also territorial predators. And when you trap a predator in a corner, it doesn't negotiate. It bites. The lumber camp massacre is a perfect bloody case study of what happens when you treat humans like machines. Eventually, the gears strip, the boiler explodes, and the shrapnel hits everyone. If you go to those coordinates today, you won't find the camp. You won't find the main cabin. You won't find the bunkhouses. You certainly won't find the ledger. The forest is efficient. It cleans up its own messes. Wood rots, iron rusts, bones turn to dust. Within 10 years of the camp closing, the roof of the main cabin would have collapsed. Within 20 years, the walls would have been little more than mounds of mossy compost. Today, that hollow is just trees again. There might be a slight depression in the ground where the cellar used to be. You might, If you are very lucky and have a metal detector, find a rusted axe head or a handful of spent shell casings buried under a century of leaf litter. But the screams are gone. The blood is gone. Nature has done what it always does. It has healed the wound. It is strange to stand in a place where you know something terrible happened and feel nothing. Just the wind, just the birds. The trees that grow there now are the great-grandchildren of the trees that witnessed the massacre. They don't remember. But the history is there if you know how to look for it. It's in the archives of the local courthouse. It's in the yellowed newspaper clippings. It's in the genealogy of families who wonder why their great-grandfather went west and never wrote back. The forest reclaims the physical evidence, but it cannot reclaim the story. That is our job. We are the memory keepers. We are the ones who dig up the ghosts and ask them what happened. Because if we don't, then those men, the ones who died and the ones who killed, truly vanish. They become just another layer of sediment in the geology of the Appalachian Mountains. They deserve to be remembered, not as heroes, not as villains, but as men. Men who were pushed too far, men who broke, men who lived and died by the sound of iron. The lumber camp massacre of 1887 is not a famous story. It isn't taught in schools. It hasn't been made into a Hollywood movie. It is a footnote, a small, ugly stain on the vast tapestry of American history. But in that small stain, we see the entire picture of an era. We see the brutality of the Industrial Revolution. We see the desperation of the working class. We see the terrifying isolation of the frontier, and we see the darkness that lies within the human heart. We like to think that we are civilized, that we are above this kind of primal violence. But put us in the woods, take away our food, take away our hope, and we are just timber beasts in waiting. Those men went into the woods to build a future. Instead, they built a tragedy. But they did build something else. They built America. The timber they cut, the timber that cost them their souls, went on to build the cities we live in. It framed the houses of the Midwest. It laid the tracks for the railroads. There is a haunting thought I want to leave you with. The wood from that forest, perhaps even the very trees that were standing witness on that bloody night, was harvested. It was milled. It was sold. It built houses that people still live in today. So, somewhere in America, there is a family sitting in a living room. They are laughing. They are safe. And they are completely unaware that the beams above their heads, the floorboards under their feet, hold a secret. They are surrounded by wood that was paid for in blood, walls that hold the echoes of a scream in their grain. History is not in the past. It is the structure of our present. We are living in the house that they built, and sometimes when the wind blows just right and the house settles, you can almost hear the sound of an axe in the distance. Good night.